Hello everybody, this is Mr. McKeever here, and today we're going to talk about the beginnings of ancient Rome. So kind of follow along as we're talking here, and we'll elaborate really where this civilization starts from. And if you are following along with the notes as well too, there are going to be a couple video clips that you'll need to watch as well too that won't really sync up well with the narration. Just pause the narration at that time, watch the videos that are there, and then you'll be able to pick back up where we're going. Alright, so this story begins mythically with the story of Romulus and Remus. So this is a Roman myth that there's these two children, these two infants that are left on the side of the Tiber River. And they are left alone, and a wolf walks up to them, and instead of doing, what every wolf in history of all things ever would have done with two infant children by themselves and eating them, the wolf then raises the two of them and nurses them so that they become, full grown adults. And it's these two brothers that will be the founders of Rome. And you can see that in the name Romulus, that's where the city of Rome actually gets its name. A conflict between the two of them leads to one killing the other. None of that is actually important to the story of Rome itself, but it's about this whole mythical story that, creates the city of Rome on the rolling hills of the Roman plains. So this is the mythical story. Now, the reality is that it's not the true story, but it's a neat little myth, so I figured I would toss it in there. The real story of the Romans begins with a group of people called the Etruscans and the Latins. The Etruscans and the Latins are the native people of Italy itself. They settled there around 1000 BCE, and things are very chaotic during that time period. Rome itself still hasn't developed. There aren't really any large cities or towns or anything. It isn't until the Greeks arrive about 300 years later that we start to see the development of the Roman culture that we kind of see today. And when we talked about ancient Greece, we talked about how, the Romans really do help borrow them. That was even a question on your guys' pre-tests. And that is kind of very indicative of this influence we see of Greek settlers coming to the Italian peninsula and helping really form this culture here. Once that happens, we start to see the Roman culture that we know of today develop. And this is with the Latin people. So the Latin people are in the middle and southern portion of Italy. To the northern portion of Italy are a group called the Etruscans. All of these peoples will eventually become the Romans that we know and love / hate today. So, what makes Rome unique is the story of the Roman Republic. So, just like the Greeks are iconically associated with democracy and tyranny as two very unique form of governments that come out of their time period, the Romans developed something called a republican government. And the Roman Republic is the first example of when we see individuals being able to vote for representatives who then make the laws for their civilization. And the Roman Republic lasts for a few hundred years. And it's this sort of pseudo-democracy in that the people do have a voice in choosing their representatives. At least some people have a choice in choosing their representatives, and then those representatives then make the laws for everyone else. Now, it's a little bit different than what we see today because it's very much tied to the social classes that exist in Rome at this time. The Senate, which is what you see in the picture here and is what is iconically known as part of the Roman tradition, is only made up of a social class called the patricians. The patricians are the wealthy landowners of Rome. It is not something that if you ever get rich that you can join into the social class. You are either born a patrician or you're born in the other social class in Roman hierarchy, which is the plebeians. The plebeians are the common folk of Rome. They are the vast majority of Rome, and they do still have a very important role in the government, as we will lay out here, thanks to things like the tribunes and the 12 tables. But this Roman Republic, as it's established during this time period, is very much tied to the patrician class. So at this point, if you actually click to the next slide, there's a video explaining all of this stuff, and you should watch that. So you would pause this video and then pick up and watch this here as it explains stuff.
Etruscan rulers in the year 509 BCE. They weren't just changing their political status.
Okay. Furthering on the story, once you hear the story of the Roman Republic, there's some other nuanced aspects of it as well too. The Roman Republic also chose something called the consul. The consuls are kind of like their version of a U.S. president. It is originally only from the patrician class, and what ends up happening, and this is where it's kind of interesting, is they would come into power. There would be two of them, and those two would be in charge of the military, in charge of the government, and everything else, and they would serve 1-year terms. This is really where we start to get our prototype of what we think of the president today, because remember, our president today is in charge of the military and really runs everything. The difference is we have a 4-year term as opposed to a 1-year. What's also kind of neat of this is that even though the consuls were only ever from the patrician class, they are selected by the plebeian class. So if you were going to be a member of the Senate who wanted to be a consul, you would have to appeal to the common folk of Rome in order to become elected as the consul, which is kind of that highest office that exists. So that's where it really ties the people into the situation. The Senate itself is a body of 300 members only for the patricians, selected by the patricians. And if there was ever times of trouble, kind of like how the Greeks had a tyrant, the Romans had what you call a dictator. Same basic concept, only for times of troubles, a ruler who takes control of everything. Now, the term dictator today is a little bit different because it's not just in times of trouble. If you have a dictator, they kind of just stay there until they die or gotten rid of. But back then, it was just during these times of trouble. And this is what life was like under the Roman Republic. The consuls are elected by chosen from the Senate. Everyone has a voice into it. The Senate makes all the laws. And you can see how this is a little bit like the system that we have here today. The consuls are the executive branch. The Senate and the Assembly, who we haven't talked about yet, are going to be like their version of the Senate and the House that we have in our government today. We have a Supreme Court that makes our decisions as to whether something is legal or not. They had a group of people called the praetors. They're going to be the kind of the judges of Rome. We have our Constitution. They have something called the 12 Tables, which we'll explain in a second. So there's definitely a lot of parallels here. The United States pulls very heavily from Rome in figuring out its governmental background and examples. But let's talk about the Assembly some say. The Assembly is this body that exists during the time of Rome, where it's made up by the plebeian class, and there are people chosen from that class to represent the people of Rome. And at the head of the assembly are people called tribunes. And these tribunes are people who, much like how the consuls run all of Rome, the tribunes speak for the people of Rome, and they hold a pretty significant role in what happens. And it would kind of best be equated like a governor in our system today. So like at the top of the totem pole is still the president. Governors hold a lot of sway as to what happens actually in the country. Everyone is subject to something called the 12 Tables. And the 12 Tables are kind of like the Constitution of Rome, in that all people's rights are established there, and this is all really laid out well in that video. So take a moment, watch through that, kind of jot down what they talk about when it comes to the 12 Tables and the tribunes to get a good understanding of what the assembly is. Once the Roman Republic is established, though, it's really time for Rome to spread from just Italy. And the way they'll do that is through warfare. The Romans have this Greek influence, so they'll look at the situation of what happens in Sparta with the Spartan phalanx, and they will make their own adjustments, much like how Alexander makes adjustments to the phalanx to build his better version of it. The Romans will do the same in creating the Roman legions. So it is their war formation that is in many ways just like the Spartan phalanx. As you can see from the picture right here, they will have the large shields. They create the shield walls. They move together. The only real addition that they have to it is that they include archers as well too. In an ideal world, whereas the Spartans were all about getting hand-to-hand combat and killing you with spears and swords, the Romans would much rather just shoot you to death with arrows. But if they had to, they could be very, very effective hand-to-hand soldiers as well too. So again, it's just another variation of the Spartan phalanx that works really well during this period. And because it works so well, the city of Rome is going to expand to conquering all of the Roman peninsula, or the Italian peninsula, by 265 BCE. So it took some time. Remember, the first Etruscans arrive in Italy, and the first Latins arrive in Italy around 1000 BCE. Around 700 BC, the Greeks come in. And then shortly after that, we see the creation of the Roman Senate. And it takes a few more hundred years to fully have this whole Rome thing start to figure itself out. But by the 3rd century BC, Rome is now humming along pretty well. And they start to expand. First, it's going to be the Italian peninsula, but then from there, it's going to be the rest of the Mediterranean world. And that's where we reach our first real significant Roman conflict called the Punic Wars. And this will lead us to another one of these videos where you're going to want to pause and kind of watch what's going on.
By 260 BC, Rome controlled more than 52,000 square miles.
Okay. So let's break down the Punic Wars as the video does. So this is a series of wars between Rome and its really only big counterpart, Carthage. So Carthage is a city that we talked about months ago, and this was originally a Phoenician colony. They have been there for a long time. We just kind of haven't been paying attention to them all that much because we've been focusing a little bit farther east in the Mediterranean world. But Carthage has developed a pretty substantial trading empire. They have a lot of influence around the world, particularly in North Africa and in areas like Spain. And now Rome is going to become their kind of rival during this period. There are 3 different series of wars that take place during this time, and these are pretty long wars. In the case of the first Punic War, I think it's 23 years passes. It's a few years when the second Punic War starts, and it's even more time after the third Punic War starts. So these aren't like a series of individual battles and it's over. We're talking years, if not decades of time lapsing with each conflict between Carthage and Rome here. In the first Punic War, we see Rome having to develop a navy for the first time. By copying the Carthaginian ships, they develop a navy, and in doing so, they are able to fight off Carthage and actually win the first conflict, despite being a really upstart city at this point, nowhere near the same influence as Carthage. And in doing so, they will gain the territory that we call today Sicily. So if you look at the map right here, Sicily is the football that the boot Italy is kicking. So it's always a good way to remember where Sicily is. The second Punic War is the famous one, though. This is when we introduce the story of Hannibal. Hannibal is the greatest of the Carthaginian generals, and he is generally considered one of the greatest generals of the ancient world. Probably with only people like Alexander and Cyrus being on a level above him as conquerors and as military leaders. He's right in that next group with people potentially like Julius Caesar and stuff like that. Well, Hannibal's story is that of a Carthaginian who watched the end of the First Punic War. So he was a child when the First Punic War ends, and he saw how the Romans kind of treated the Carthaginians, and he is really embittered about it. So what he will do is he will gain a massive army as he grows up, and he decides that he is going to attack Rome as a response to the First War. But since the Romans have controlled the sea now after the First Punic War, he has to do it by land. So he will travel from Carthage all the way through North Africa, and from North Africa up into Spain, and from Spain into France, and then he crosses the Alps mountain range. And what makes this such a significant trek is not only does it take years for him to do this, but he's doing this with some pretty unconventional forces. Not only does he have a large army with him, but he's also bringing with him some elephants. And he thinks this is going to provide him a pretty substantial advantage against the Romans in his fights against them. Much like how the people of the Indus Valley fought against Alexander with elephants, he's going to be trying to do the same against the Romans. Unfortunately, elephants are not really mountain folk. They don't travel well on mountains. Most of them don't survive the trek across the Alps. They end up becoming food supply for his soldiers, but when the soldiers do finish crossing the Alps, and the thousands of them that he still has, he is able to just wreak havoc on the Italian peninsula for years. And it isn't until, I think, almost 10 years has passed of Hannibal just kind of attacking the Romans as he saw fit wherever on the Italian peninsula that he just runs out of resources and eventually is defeated. But it's more of a factor that he's been fighting for so long, and the Romans have had no answers to him, that it's more of a loss out of what we call attrition, where it just takes time and it's a loss of resources, than it is really he ever getting outsmarted. Well, at the end of the Second Punic War, Hannibal's kind of pushed out of the image, and Rome kind of maintains its superiority again. Despite being kicked around by Hannibal for a long time, Rome ends up coming out on top. And then a few years later, we see the Third Punic Wars. And this is really where Rome just kind of is done with this whole situation. We're going to gloss over the fighting itself, but just so you guys know, at the end of the Third Punic Wars, Rome is just so fed up with Carthage that they have the entire city burned to the ground, all of the people of Carthage sold into slavery, and the fields around the city of Carthage are salted so that nothing can grow there again. Like, this is we would call today like a scorched earth policy of just like burning everything to the ground and making it so no one can ever use it again. After that Third Punic War, though, Rome is the dominant power of the Mediterranean Sea. There's no one who's going to be able to challenge them for a long time. They are continuing to expand, but it doesn't mean everything is perfect in Rome. The increased size of Rome now is going to provide some logistical difficulties for the Roman government. Wars are great, but it also means that you're pulling a lot of resources from the people back home. So if you're part of the lower class, you're feeling this hurt a lot more than the upper classes. You have been working, a lot of your resources, the stuff that you farm, stuff like that may have been pulled towards the war effort, and that makes you feel a little bit more disconnected. Also, if you aren't really close to Rome and you don't interact with Rome itself, you feel very, very disconnected as well too, which is kind of the case when the empire continues to grow and grow and grow. So that's going to be a problem. The other big problem is that the military has kind of grown a little bit too big for its britches here. The individual Roman legions are very self-sufficient. They can pretty much run on their own for years without having much interaction from Rome at all. And what we end up seeing is some of these legions just kind of becoming autonomous armies that are wandering around the Roman areas without much influence from home. And that's not a good thing. You don't want just really trained soldiers wandering around doing whatever they want without direction, because that's probably going to lead to some pretty bad stories. All of this is going to help lead to the fall of the Roman Republic as we know it. The farmers of Rome are losing more and more support. They can't compete with wealthier landowners who are buying up land. So this is going to create a situation where these farmers lose their farms and they start to become very upset. They either search Rome in order to find a job, which sometimes does not exist, or they end up just wandering the countryside, becoming a very dissatisfied group of wanderers. And it is until the arrival of these two guys named Tiberius and Gaius, who become the tribunes of the plebeian class, who really try to go out of their way to improve the life of the average person in Rome. But they become the heroes of the plebeians, the very simple citizen of Rome, and because of this, they actually end up getting themselves killed by members of the patrician class who don't want to improve the situation for the plebeians. They would rather everyone stay the way they are, where all the power is considered or concentrated, and the wealthy people and the poor people have little to nothing. And all of this is really kind of building the atmosphere needed for the arrival of a guy named Julius Caesar. For the average person in Rome, the only real opportunity that you had for any kind of social improvement or to improve your life was through the military. The small landowners who no longer either have their farms, their homes, will be hired on as military soldiers. And as soldiers, they'll have an opportunity to get paid by the Roman Republic, to have a job, and this makes really the soldiers indebted to whoever their leader is. They don't ever see the Senate because, in fact, it is against the law for a Roman legion to ever be in the city of Rome itself in order to kind of prevent the military from taking over. So in this world, the only person that the legions are accountable to is their general, the person in charge of them. And some of these generals are actually really awesome. And the best example of this is this guy named Julius Caesar. He has become best friends with the members of his legion. They love him, they adore him. He will do everything he can to improve the lives of the soldiers, try to guarantee them land when their service is done, get them paid really well, and this makes these people personally indebted to Caesar himself. And when Caesar starts showing that he's just not only this great leader of these people, but also an incredible general, he starts really swaying the hearts and minds of everyone in Rome that he is this truly great leader who's going to change Rome forever. And this is going to cause a conflict in Rome, because the old society, the patricians and the members of the Senate, start to see Caesar as this threat to their own power. And it's going to create a confrontation that is iconically told in the story of Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, which I believe you guys are reading right now. What I want you guys to do is to use your knowledge of the story of Julius Caesar and really kind of play it into what we're talking about right now. Because Caesar is kind of the perfect example of what happens when political intrigue starts to go awry. He is part of what we call a triumvirate. 3 different leaders who all have kind of control of what is going on. It's him, this lifelong politician named Crassus, and a guy named Pompey. And using this triumvirate, the 3 of them and their influence, Caesar's going to get himself declared consul and serve for a year just like the normal system ascribes that he can. And after that, he gets the same alliance between these 2 guys to get himself named the governor of Gaul. And Gaul is what we call France today. So he gets himself appointed governor, and he goes out to Gaul, conquers a ton of territory, and he sends back all these letters back to Rome talking about how he's such a great leader, and the people just really fall in love with Caesar. And his support in Rome just seems to keep growing amongst the people of Rome. And people who are in power start to see him as a rival. Like, he is gathering so much support of the people that they don't need these other leaders. So Pompey, starting to see him as a threat, asks Caesar to come home. And Caesar agrees to come home. Pompey wanted to kind of keep him close, keep him so he couldn't keep creating all these great stories of how he conquers everything. Except Roman tradition, as we said before, says that a general can't bring his armies into Rome itself. Caesar doesn't really think that applies to him. So Caesar travels back to Rome, and he brings his Roman legions with him. And when he does that, Pompey freaks out. And he's like, oh my god, he's sending his army to come kill me. Now, was he probably trying to do that? Yeah, probably true. We don't know for sure, because what ends up happening is Pompey runs away from Rome, and Caesar just kind of follows him. So Pompey will flee to Greece. So Caesar will go to Greece with his Roman legions and chase after Pompey, and he fights off Pompey's forces there. So when Pompey then runs to Turkey, Caesar follows him. He beats him there. And then he'll go all the way across the Mediterranean Ocean to Spain. Caesar follows him there, and he beats him again. And then back into Egypt. Follows him there, beats him again, goes back to Rome, and finally catches Pompey and defeats him one last time. The people of Rome have heard this entire story, and this is arguably where Caesar is his greatest. He said he's a great propagandist. So he's telling the stories of all of his great victories around the world, and people just love him. He becomes the hero, Pompey is the villain, and when he returns to Rome, the people hold a vote and declare him not just the consul of Rome, but now he is officially dictator. And shortly after that, they say not only is he dictator of Rome, but now he's going to be the dictator for life. He has gone around the world, beaten every enemy that he can, created extraordinary stories that he's expressed back in Rome. The people love him. They adore him. He's also had some pretty interesting scenarios in Egypt when he goes there, meets a woman named Cleopatra. They have a pretty interesting affair between them. All of this creates this mythical Julius Caesar. And that mythical Julius Caesar lives up to his name as a leader. he institutes a ton of reforms to make life better for the people of Rome. He gives citizenship for those who are living in the provinces like Gaul and Hispania, which is what they called Spain. He creates jobs for the poor people. He allowed colonies to be created that would give land to people who didn't have land in Rome in order to, make the people happier. He increased the pay for all the soldiers. All of those things are great. They're wonderful accomplishments of Caesar, and each one of them builds his support amongst the people more and more. But Caesar is really looking to have total control over everything. He kind of has it, but the Senate's still around. And the Senate now views Caesar as a direct threat to their power, and this is going to lead to one of the most iconic confrontations ever. The Roman Senate versus Julius Caesar. And this little clip will spoil the story of Julius Caesar if you guys haven't gotten to the ending yet. So if you haven't gotten to the ending, skip this clip. If you have gotten to the ending, feel free to watch. But yeah, so this leads us to our last aspect of this lesson. It's gone a little bit longer, but I apologize for that. But let's talk about what I want you guys to do next. So the story of Julius Caesar is one of these great epic events. He has this iconic event where he travels across the Rubicon River, where he's in the Senate itself, like all of these great stories. And I want you guys to act out some of these. So in groups of 4 or 3, depending on the breakdown of your guys' class, you're going to act out the iconic events from Julius Caesar. These are not going to be long performances. They're roughly 1 minute long, but everyone in your group must participate. You're going to research each of these events, do a little bit independent research outside from what you saw here in class or what you already know. You're going to plan out your skit, and then when I come back from youth and government, you are going to act those out in front of everyone. You can have some scripts. You don't have to have scripts, but the 4 different events are going to be Caesar leading the Roman legions in Gaul, Caesar crossing the Rubicon River back into Rome, Caesar, his relationship with Cleopatra in Egypt, and what happens to Caesar in the Senate at the end. So these 4 events, you guys are going to break into groups and act out. So take some time today in class or during the next period to kind of plan these things out in order to create these 1 minute skips that really will bring us to life the story of Julius Caesar. If you have any questions, let me know, but otherwise that is the early foundation of the Roman Republic, and I'll talk to you guys next time.